Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Andy Serkis directs the remarkable true story of Robin Cavendish in Breathe. In 1958, Robin Cavendish, played by Andrew Garfield, travels to Kenya with his new wife Diana Blacker, played by Claire Foy, as a tea miner, when he suddenly contracts polio and becomes paralysed from the neck down and requires a respirator to breathe. Robin is initially despondent, but Diana refuses to give up on her love and manages to get Robin out of the hospital and takes care of him and their son Jonathan, later played by Dean Charles Chapman. Robin and Diana become advocates for the disabled, developing pioneering technology and changing attitudes as Robin is determined to live life to the fullest. Breathe is the first film directed by Andy Serkis, which on the surface may seem like a fairly unorthodox choice given the actor's motion capture background, although technically speaking this is actually the second project that he's helmed, the first being a motion capture version of The Jungle Book that he filmed for Warner Brothers back in 2015, but of course due to the Disney version has been delayed, so we won't see that until late next year. So Breathe is the first of his projects to see release. Speaking of first, it's also the first film from his new studio that he founded, The Imaginarium. Their second film, the horror movie The Ritual with Ray Spall, will be something I'll be reviewing in the coming weeks. And he founded that studio, which is both a production house and a motion capture house, with a fellow film producer by the name of Jonathan Cavendish. That's right, this is the story of his father, Robin, who was a disability activist, and he's campaigned for years to try and bring that story to the screen. And you can very much tell, watching the movie, that this subject is very near and dear to the creator's heart. Serkis himself has a sister with MS, so clearly disability was a subject matter that's very close to him and that he wanted to address, and look at the changes and attitudes that Robin himself helped bring about. Robin is very strongly portrayed by Andrew Garfield, who has to undergo a major transformation in this movie, especially given that he's quite well known for his physical roles, in particular his stint as Spider-Man. And I think what Serkis has brought to the movie, given his experience with motion capture and performance technique, is trying to bring those aspects to Garfield's performance and the way that he directs it. And Garfield portrays Robin before he's afflicted with polio in the first 10-15 minutes of the movie, and the film has to very quickly establish that this is a very physical, very youthful and adventurous man, and they do that by getting him to play a lot of sports, be it cricket or tennis or dancing with a hula hoop, the latter being the first real significant indication that something is very seriously wrong with him. After he's afflicted with his condition, he suddenly has all of that taken away from him, or at least so he thinks, and he doesn't believe that he has a lot of prospects and quickly falls into a deep depression about his condition, especially because the doctors don't think he will survive very long. They give him a prognosis of only months. And so he's in this very bleak situation at first, not least because he finds himself locked in this body in a hospital room surrounded with fellow sufferers of paralysis who are surviving, but they're not living. He feels trapped. And that becomes a huge component part of the movie, that just because you're disabled doesn't mean you can't have quality of life. You don't have to spend the rest of your days confined to a hospital bed inside a ward surrounded by people with iron lungs. But the problem is trying to change the attitudes, and what Breathe shows is just how recently those thoughts about the disabled have changed, and it starts with the doctors taking care of them because they only see them as patients, and they don't really see them as ever having the possibility of venturing back out into the world because of the severity of their conditions. They're required to be on ventilators the entire time because they need those to breathe. But Robin is determined to defy them. He's determined to be out of the hospital, despite the fact that the doctor, who most notably embodies all of these ideas, and of course very snobbily portrayed by Jonathan Hyde, who you might recall from films like The Mummy or Anaconda, he tries to go past those limitations and test them and do everything he can to be as mobile as possible. And He wants that for every other person that's in the ward, and he wants that for all disabled people, and trying to reintegrate them back into society. That is a major part of the healing process, and trying to acclimatise to life after what's happened to them. And so this becomes the key part of the story, but the first section of it is Robin learning to accept his condition himself, and in spite of all the things that he manages to accomplish, his life is still somewhat precarious, as seen in a very intense sequence involving a plug and a dog that shows just what could happen in the wrong circumstance. And Garfield really steps up to the plate in what is a very demanding part, given he has to portray someone using only his face. But the thing is, that's one of the most powerful tools an actor has at his disposal, and so much of the movie can be read by his expressions, which are very nuanced, and you can really see the transformation of the character just by simply looking at his eyes and his face, and you can really see a lot of detail in it, and it's clear that Garfield has spent a lot of time trying to make sure that he's expressive as possible. There are a couple of moments where he maybe overdoes that somewhat to an extent, but I can't really blame him, given that he has to essentially carry this movie with only his head alone. But there are inevitably going to be critics that will compare this to The Theory of Everything, and they are quite similar biopics given their stories of a couple having to overcome disability in their own way. And there is definitely a comparison to be made in the fact that I think both movies make a very similar misstep. There's a moment at the end of Theory where there's a dream sequence where Stephen Hawking imagines his mobility coming back. Early on in Breathe, there's another such dream sequence where Robin imagines himself and he suddenly regains the use of his hands and he starts pulling out the tube in his throat. And I think in both movies, that's a false step, because first of all, I think that's really on the nose when it comes to attitudes towards disability, that people who are disabled suddenly like to imagine themselves as being able to rise out of their chairs or their beds. But also, I think it reminds you that they're actors playing a role. It snaps you out of the illusion. Luckily, Breathe does it fairly early on, but it's still something that I thought was unnecessary given the framing of the narrative. One of the directorial choices that Serkis makes that really helps Garfield's performance is his choice of aspect ratio. You've probably already noticed it by now, that very narrow frame, which I think is 255, if not wider. This has very much come back into vogue in recent years, since Tarantino did it on The Hateful Eight, which was shot on 70mm, and again last year on La La Land, and Breathe uses it for very pointed effect. And the first one is very obvious because it's meant to be showing how very claustrophobic Robin is inside both his body and the hospital ward that he's in. And what Serkis does that helps Garfield immensely is that whenever he frames a close-up, it's usually with Garfield's face dead centre in the middle of the frame, so because of the expanses surrounding him, it makes you concentrate on every muscle and you see every emotion on his face. It really calls attention to Garfield's performance, and I think that's terrific direction there. There is that obvious metaphor at first of feeling very tight inside the frame, but once he moves out of the hospital, then the real purpose of that aspect ratio becomes increasingly clear, especially once it moves on to different international territories on their travels, whenever they move to Kenya or they go to Spain later on in the movie, and suddenly we get these huge, wide expanses, wider than even the eye can see, and it looks breathtaking on screen. It looks truly gorgeous, and it looks hugely cinematic, these great expansive vistas, and you think, wow, this is amazing, this is a huge, great adventure. And that's exactly the attitude that you're supposed to be taking from this movie, and it shows just how great of a filmmaker Serkis can be in the future. I think he shows real craft in this movie, but not in a really showy way. It's something that's very subtle, but it creeps up on you. And that sequence where they go out to the clinic and they see how the patients are being treated, that again benefits from this. It's the most powerful scene in the film, and I think it's purely because of the way that it's been shot. I think because of that, you get a real sense of the scale of the problem that they're having to confront, and it shocks you. A more conventional aspect ratio would have weakened this movie, and it certainly sets the film apart on a visual level from many others of its ilk. But while Garfield has the showier role, I think it's Claire Foy who is the real emotional anchor of the movie. I think she is truly tremendous as Diana, really showing her love and devotion to her husband. Even when he gives up on himself, she doesn't. There's a moment where Robin asks her to leave him behind, and she refuses that request. She is determined to make sure the man she loves is still a part of her life, but also this family that they've created. Jonathan was born after Robin contracted polio, and she wants him to know his father. And that becomes this powerful force. She has a real strength that transfers over to Robin, and they work together as a unit. And it is at its centre a love story. She is committed to her husband even if she has to take care of him because she loves him that much. Together they make each other stronger, and Foy is powerfully portraying that. There is a real kind of steeliness to this performance, which makes sense because the movie is about having to face cruel twists of fate, and doing so with grace and good humour and invention and warmth. And that is a crucial part of the movie. This kind of warmth and just sheer lust for life that runs through it. This is a movie that tackles its subject matter with a real sense of optimism and hope. It sees possibilities, and you can see that in the way that certain sequences are played. The actual sequence where Robin is taken out of hospital, it almost plays like something out of a caper movie where they're scrambling to get his bed through the hospital and sneak him out, and it's somewhat played for humour in that respect, and that's unusual. But that does bring up something of a problem with the movie, in that I think it does fall into a biopic trap where it focuses more on the events than the actual figures it's meant to be portraying. And this can be especially felt as the film moves into its second hour, where it starts focusing on all the inventions that Robin helped pioneer because he was determined to live his life, and as such, new technology had to be developed to accommodate that. Most crucially, his special modified wheelchair with a ventilator built into it that changed the lives of many disabled people afterwards, and the film on some level is about them trying to distribute that across the country. The issue on a storytelling level is that it does have a feeling of then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And while Serkis certainly handles that with his direction by making them little escapades in their own right, be it them trying to modify a car so that Robin can ride inside of it, or their trip to Spain inside a cargo plane and then there's a malfunction with the wheelchair, those are all handled well, but you wish that there was a stronger through line, that the crucial theme of the movie about overcoming disability was maybe a bit more present. It does feel like the film is perhaps slightly too long and a little bit too baggy because of this. But where this shortcoming can be most clearly seen is in its supporting cast, who I don't think are really very well characterised, and they appear and disappear out of the film at random intervals, which is something of a shame because the film does try to characterise them as a group of lovable eccentrics, most notably Teddy Hall, who is the Oxford professor that helps develop Robin's chair. He's played by Hugh Bonneville, who pops up in a handful of scenes and brings some wit to the proceedings, as does Tom Hollander. And Serkis does indulge himself in a little bit of CGI trickery in having Hollander play both of Diana's twin brothers. And he works off of the compositing fairly well, but generally he's called upon to be lovable and a little bit flustered and sort of a bit colourful, and certainly makes the film feel a little less dour than it could have been. But a lot of the supporting cast I don't think they're really given enough time in the movie to shine. Stephen Mangan pops up maybe about 3/4 of the way through the film as the doctor who sets up a charity with Robin to help the severely disabled, who plays a crucial role towards the end of the movie. But he appears so late into the proceedings, and Diana Rigg gets a very prominent credit for a very small, almost cameo-like scene where she plays a wealthy woman that they approach to get funding. As the film moves into its final stretch, it does veer into difficult territory, but I think Serkis handles it with the same sensitivity that he's handled the rest of the movie, even if it does veer into the sentimental, but understandably so. And as such, this subject matter is handled very respectfully and very tactfully, I think, which is more I can say for some other recent films on that same issue. But my main problem with that last section of the movie is simply from a historical point of view, in that for some reason the filmmakers have transplanted the events to a decade earlier than they occurred in real life, and I can't fully fathom why they decided to do that. There must have been a dramatic decision why they decided to portray things that way, but aside from that timeline weirdness, I think what audiences will take away from the movie overall is that Robin Cavendish lived his life on his own terms, despite what happened to him, and I think it's a powerfully inspiring story because of that. And despite certain issues with the film's script, I think because of the sterling performances from the two leads, and just the sheer strength of the story that it's portraying, you really come out with an appreciation for Robin Cavendish and everything that he's done, and how much that we've managed to move forward in our treatment of people with severe disabilities. Breathe is a beautifully inspiring story, the strength of which manages to transcend the conventions of the biopic. Andrew Garfield and Claire Foy deliver brilliant performances as the leads, and showing the full commitment and love of the couple they're portraying, with Garfield especially great in a difficult part. In his technical debut, Serkis directs this story with sensitivity and compassion, but also with an old-fashioned sense of adventure that's in keeping with the optimistic outlook the film portrays its subject. The film does lapse into the episodic in trying to cover all of Cavendish's accomplishments, and the supporting cast do feel a bit thinly characterised as a result, but its powerful message and warmth overall leave the lasting impression of a life fully lived regardless of disability. If you like this review, please support my work over at Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.